At 9 p.m. on September 12, 2002, a blue Chevy Blazer rolls out of the HB supermarket lot in San Antonio, late summer heat, hanging heavy headlights sweeping past the security gate, and 12 minutes later, an ATM camera records a black Ford F-150 moving in the same direction. This is the last clean thread in a night that will fray into silence for 20 years. A mother waits at a kitchen table as calls ring unanswered. The riverbank will be searched. The city will whisper, and decades later, a torn handbag will rise from hard red earth, its strap carrying DNA that points toward a familiar neighbor. The case that cooled will ignite. The mask of kindness will crack, and a family's candle of hope will burn brighter and sharper than ever. What followed that Blazer into the dark? And why did the trail vanish within minutes, despite cameras, witnesses, and a city on alert when the old handbag surfaces in 2022? Whose touch does science reveal? And how does that single strand pull the whole hidden story back into the light? If you want to uncover these answers, like this video and subscribe to Unscripted Tales, and turn on the bell icon for upcoming episodes. Tell me in the comments which city you are watching from. Let us reach 5,000 likes so this cold case travels farther and faster. The Blazer clears the lot, engine steady, taillights shrinking toward the river road as humidity presses low over asphalt. The ATM lens blinks to life and catches the black pickup pacing the same route, shape gliding through haze. Two vehicles, one ahead and one just behind, sliding into a corridor of shadow on one side. A kitchen clock ticks toward 9:10 as a plate cools, and a mother watches the door on the other. Traffic thins and streetlights stutter across the windshield like a metronome. The night offers nothing else. No horn, no skid, no cry that anyone can place. Only these frames remain. A departure at 9 o'clock and a truck at 9:12. Timestamps etched like small iron nails hold onto them, because from these few moments, the entire search will begin. The night in San Antonio, pressed down like a heavy blanket. It was September 12, 2002, and the summer had not yet loosened its grip. The air was sticky, the streets almost breathless, and the sound of cicadas carried through dim neighborhoods. Under that heat, Marissa Delgado stepped out of her long shift at the bank. She was 26, still in her light work blouse, her dark hair neatly tied back, moving quickly because she knew her mother had set dinner on the table. She steered her old blue Chevy Blazer into the parking lot of the HB supermarket, a place she knew well, and walked inside for a short stop. A few bags of groceries, nothing more. The store's lights gleamed against the humid glass doors, while the outside night thickened with shadows. At exactly 9 o'clock, the supermarket camera caught her figure moving across the lot, the bags in hand. She unlocked her Blazer, climbed in, and the headlights washed across the pavement as the vehicle pulled toward the exit gate. The clock stamped the moment as the Blazer slipped onto the road. Fading into the warmth of the night, the scene appeared ordinary. A young woman finishing a long day and heading home to her family. But time was already turning heavy, and within minutes, those taillights would carry her beyond reach. Somewhere beyond that exit, something waited, and when the minutes stretched on, silence would take its place. What happened after those headlights disappeared into the night would soon leave a family searching, a city whispering, and a truth hidden for 20 years. As the Blazer rolled out of the lot, Marissa lifted her phone and pressed a quick call. Her voice carried steady but warm. She told her mother she would be home in 10 minutes. That promise was simple, a routine comfort, and on the other end, Elena Delgado smiled with relief. Dinner was ready, and the family would sit together soon. In the small kitchen of their West Side home, plates were already set. Steam rose faintly from food cooling on the table. Above the stove, the wall clock ticked with slow certainty, each second heavier than the last. Carlos, her younger brother, leaned on the sofa nearby, absently clicking the TV remote, though his eyes often wandered to that clock. 10 minutes came. The minute hand shifted again. Still no sound of the Blazer outside. Elena dialed her daughter's number, waiting as the tone echoed into emptiness. The call rang without end. She tried again. This time, there was only silence. The kind of silence that grows thick and presses into the walls. The food on the plates lost its warmth. The air itself felt heavier. Each tick of the clock sounded sharper, as if time was warning that something had gone wrong. The wait that should have been short began to stretch unbearably long. What began as an ordinary night was already changing into something darker, and within minutes the unanswered phone would become a family's first alarm. But while the house filled with quiet dread, a shadow on the road was already trailing Maurice's path. Only minutes after the blue Chevy Blazer passed through the supermarket exit, another set of headlights cut across the same stretch of road. A nearby ATM camera caught the movement, the grainy lens capturing a black Ford F-150 sliding into view. Its shape was blurred, its license unreadable, but the angle showed clearly that it was moving in the very direction Marissa had taken. The two images stood side by side in time. The first, a young woman heading home with groceries in her car. The second, a heavy truck following close behind. Nothing else in the footage showed cars between them. Only the Blazer first, and the pickup next. The night air was damp and restless, carrying haze that clung to the road. In the camera's flickering frame, the truck appeared for only a moment before fading back into the darkness. After that, there were no more cameras. No more records. Only silence and shadow. That small strip of footage would become the final trace of Marissa's journey. A haunting fragment of evidence that left more questions than answers. Because when the sun rose the next morning, the Blazer was gone, and so was Marissa. By the time the first light crept into San Antonio, Elena Delgado's hope had thinned into fear. The Blazer had not appeared, and Marissa's bed remained empty. Elena's trembling hands clutched the phone as she called the police, her voice cracking with every word. Within hours, the San Antonio Police Department classified the case as a missing person and mobilized their response. Patrol cars swept through the quiet streets, red and blue lights flashing against porches and windows. Officers knocked on doors, asking about the blue Chevy Blazer, showing Marissa's photo, searching for anyone who might have seen her after 9 o'clock. At the family home, a K-9 unit arrived. An officer carried one of Marissa's shirts from her bedroom. The dogs pressed their noses deep into the fabric, then pulled forward with urgency. Leading handlers toward the riverbank. Search boats pushed slowly across the San Antonio River, their lights sweeping reeds and grass. Officers leaned over rails, scanning every shadow on the water's surface. Overhead, a small prototype flycam, the city's new tool, circled in the humid air, its lens capturing long stretches of dark shoreline. Everyone involved understood the truth that weighed heavily on every missing person case. The first 48 hours were critical, and time was already slipping fast. Local media descended almost immediately. KENS 5 and KSAT 12 cameras lined the Delgado front yard, lights glaring against the family's small home. Elena, her face pale with exhaustion, stood before microphones, voice trembling as she begged the community for help. If anyone had seen her daughter, she pleaded, they must come forward. Her words carried into living rooms across the city that evening, flashing on television screens during dinner, and as her voice cracked with fear, San Antonio began to take Marissa's disappearance personally. The search had only just begun, but already the city felt the weight of something far darker than a simple disappearance. As Elena's plea echoed through living rooms across San Antonio, the community began to stir with urgency. Neighbors, friends, and strangers alike gathered stacks of flyers bearing Marissa's face. Her gentle smile was suddenly taped onto lampposts, slipped under store counters, and pressed into the hands of people walking down crowded streets. In the Latinx neighborhood where the Delgado family lived, the search for Marissa became personal, as if every household had lost a daughter of their own. Guadalupe Church opened its doors late into the night, the sanctuary filled with candlelight as voices carried prayers into the heavy air. Dozens stood shoulder to shoulder, heads bowed, eyes wet with fear and hope. In the center of it all, Marissa's photograph rested against a cluster of glowing candles, her face shining in the dim light like a plea for guidance. The silence between prayers was thick, broken only by quiet sobs and the rustle of tissue paper. Then, a witness stepped forward with words that sharpened the search. They reported seeing the blue Chevy Blazer turning onto a dark and isolated riverside road around 9:30 that night. The detail gripped investigators, and police quickly sealed off the stretch. Flashlights swept along dirt paths and thick brush. Floodlights cut into the trees as canine units barked sharply, pulling handlers through uneven ground. The search was no longer just law enforcement. Volunteers moved in, flashlights trembling in their hands as they pushed through bushes and trails. Their voices called Marissa's name into the night, the echoes vanishing into the dark river air. For every moment hope flickered, dread pressed harder. As if the night itself had swallowed something it refused to return. And as the hours passed, the unanswered question grew heavier. Where had the Blazer gone once it turned off that lonely road? The search along the river dragged through the night and into the following day. But by the end of the critical 48 hours, no trace of the blue Blazer had surfaced. No clothing, no belongings, not even a tire mark that could confirm where Marissa had gone. The urgency of rescue shifted into the weight of investigation. The missing person case hardened into something colder. Something heavier. Detective Andrew Collins, a seasoned officer in his early 30s, was placed at the head of the investigation. His first task was to rebuild the night of September 12th, step by step. Reports showed Marissa finishing her bank shift, stopping at the HB supermarket, and leaving at 9 o'clock with groceries in hand. The ATM camera had already been logged, its grainy clip replayed again and again in Collins's office. Each time, the same haunting frame appeared. The black Ford F-150 tailing the Blazer just minutes after it left the lot. The plate was too blurred, leaving only the outline of a truck fading into darkness. Collins pressed further into Marissa's personal life, questioning those closest to her. Miguel Alvarez, her former boyfriend, was brought in quickly. Their relationship had been passionate, but it ended not long before her disappearance. Miguel offered his whereabouts for that night, and multiple friends confirmed he had been with them. His alibi held, and though suspicion lingered for a moment, the evidence cleared him completely. It was through conversations with neighbors and friends that another name began to surface. Hector Ramirez. He was the owner of a small auto shop just blocks away from the Delgado home. Many knew him as friendly, but others quietly admitted that Hector had once shown interest in Marissa, leaving flowers and offering rides. She had always been polite, but firm in turning him away. The whispers painted him as frustrated by her rejection. Collins interviewed Hector directly. In a grease-stained mechanic shirt, Hector answered calmly. He claimed that on the night of September 12th, he had been at his shop working late with a fellow mechanic. That was his alibi. A quick phone call from police confirmed the story, and no further verification was made. With no physical evidence against him, Hector was left alone. But in Collins's notes, a line remained underlined. Ramirez neighbor, interest in victim. Alibi week, the early leads were slipping through fingers, and the investigation balanced on shadows. The question now pressed harder than ever. Without the car, without evidence, where would the trail of Marissa Delgado lead next? Weeks turned into months, and the case that once filled nightly news with urgency began to thin into silence. Detectives searched vacant lots, combed riverbanks again, and rechecked old witness notes, but the blue Chevy Blazer never appeared. There was no body, no sign of struggle, and no belongings beyond the groceries she carried that night. The file grew thicker with pages, but every lead folded into another dead end. By early 2003, the police admitted publicly that there had been no progress. The announcement landed like a hammer on the Delgado family. For Alina, it was more than a lack of answers. It was a slow erasure of her daughter's presence in the city's mind. And as the investigation stalled, speculation filled the gap. Some neighbors whispered that Marissa had run away to escape family pressure. Others spread tales that she had fallen into debt and fled across the border into Mexico. A few even claimed criminals had taken her, and that she would never return. Each rumor cut deeper into Elena's heart. She knew her daughter had not left by choice, but the whispers pressed down harder than silence. Carlos, still young and full of anger, clashed openly with those who spoke these things. He carried the weight of protecting his sister's memory. But anger did not bring her back, and it did not stop the gossip. By late 2004, the San Antonio Police Department held an internal meeting and quietly decided that the Delgado file had exhausted its resources. The papers were stamped and placed into storage. Marissa's case was officially archived as a cold case. When the folder was slid onto a dusty shelf, a mother's last thread of trust in the system seemed to vanish. Alina returned home to a quiet house, her daughter's room untouched, her faith sinking beneath the weight of silence. From that moment forward, hope belonged only to the candle Alina lit each year, while the world around her slowly forgot the name of Marissa Delgado. But while time moved on, it was carving deep scars into the family, leaving them to wonder how many more years would pass before a single trace of truth would appear. After the file was shelved, time did not heal. It only stretched the pain into long years of waiting. In the Delgado home, Marissa's room remained untouched, as if she might walk in at any moment. The bed was still neatly made, her books lined up, a teddy bear sitting patiently on the shelf. Alina opened that door often, standing in silence, her hands trembling on the frame, whispering prayers into the still air. Every September 12th, the day her daughter vanished, Alina set a small white candle on the table. She lit it carefully, watching the flame flicker in the breeze from the window. Each year, the candle was new, but the ritual was the same. Neighbors would sometimes stop by for prayers, though over time the gatherings grew smaller, until only a few remained. Still, Alina never stopped. The candle became her vow that her daughter had not been forgotten. Carlos grew into adulthood, under the shadow of his sister's absence. Marriage and children came, but the wound of 2002 never faded. In the new decade, he turned to the internet, joining missing person forums, sharing Marissa's photo and story with strangers willing to listen. He followed every tip that surfaced, no matter how fragile. Once he drove all the way to Laredo after hearing of a woman who resembled his sister. He returned empty-handed, heartbroken. But even that disappointment did not silence him. For him, keeping her name alive was the only way to fight against the quiet that had swallowed her case. The candle in Alina's home and the relentless searches by Carlos became the family's two fragile anchors. One burned steady in the night, the other wandered roads chasing shadows. Both carried the same message: hope had not been buried, even when the rest of the world had turned away. But hope, no matter how strong, still waited for something tangible, something real, that could break the silence which had lasted for 20 years. It was June of 2022 when the silence that had lasted for 20 years was suddenly broken. In a new housing development on the southern edge of San Antonio, the ground was being torn open by heavy machines. Excavators dug deep into red earth, the engines roaring as dust and clay lifted into the air. One worker's shovel struck something hard that was not stone or wood. At first, they thought it was just buried trash, left behind long ago. But as they pulled it up, the truth revealed itself. In the dirt lay a decayed leather handbag. The strap was frayed, the zipper rusted shut, the fabric nearly falling apart from years underground. An older worker forced it open with a screwdriver, and the contents spilled into the light of day for the first time in decades. A faded Nokia phone, its battery cover missing, a warped bank card with the logo of a local bank still faintly visible, and tucked inside, damp papers that still carried a name. The letters were blurred but legible. Marissa Delgado de Workers froze. They did not know the story, but they felt immediately that they had unearthed something important. The site manager called police, and soon the handbag was logged as evidence and delivered to the San Antonio Police Department. Detective Samuel Ortiz of the cold case unit was the one who received it. For years, he had read Marissa's name in the archives, her case, a ghost that haunted the department. Now, at last, something physical was in front of him. Ortiz laid the items out carefully, his gloved hands moving over the ruined bag. The useless phone, the fragile documents. He whispered to himself that after 20 years they had finally found a trace. The bag was transferred to the forensic lab. Under bright white lights, technicians examined every surface. They cleaned mud from the strap and ran advanced tools never available in 2002. From the worn leather, they lifted a trace of skin cells. Under the microscope, DNA began to take shape. It was not Marissa's, it belonged to an unknown male, unrelated to her family. For the first time in 2 decades, the silence had cracked. The handbag carried proof that someone else's hands had touched Marissa's belongings before or after she disappeared. And now, investigators were left with a chilling question. Who did that DNA belong to, and what secret had it carried in silence for 20 years? The discovery of Marissa's handbag was more than a clue. It was a spark. Within days, the San Antonio Police Department announced that the case was no longer cold. It was officially reopened, and the file that had gathered dust for almost 20 years was pulled from the shelves and placed firmly on Detective Samuel Ortiz's desk. Ortiz knew from the start that this was not just another case. It was a responsibility the department had failed to carry 2 decades earlier. He flipped through the old reports and quickly saw what had been left undone. Witnesses had given statements that were never followed through. The black Ford F-150 caught on camera had never been traced to a plate. Hector Ramirez's alibi had been cleared with nothing more than a single phone call. The errors were marked in red in Ortiz's notes, sharp reminders of how easily the truth had slipped away. Determined not to repeat the same mistakes, Ortiz called in a small group of trusted officers and forensic technicians. Together, they formed a dedicated cold case task force. In their new office, a large wall map of San Antonio was pinned with red markers. One pin marked the HB supermarket where Marissa was last seen. Another marked the ATM where the black pickup was captured on film. Further pins pointed to the river road where witnesses had reported suspicious sounds. Hector's auto shop just blocks from the Delgado home, and the suburban construction site where the handbag had surfaced in 2022. Every report, every photo, and every scrap of old evidence was brought out of storage. Hair strands, fabric fibers, and documents once dismissed as useless were now fed through modern forensic tools. Technology had advanced in 2 decades, and what once had given nothing could now whisper new truths. Ortiz stood back in that office, watching his team move with energy and focus. The case was no longer buried in silence. It had been reborn, and the city was watching once again. But reopening the file was only the beginning. To find the truth, Ortiz needed to return to the very streets and voices that had been overlooked before. And some of those voices still remembered details that could no longer be ignored. Detective Ortiz knew that paper files alone would not bring the truth forward. People carried memories, and even if those memories had aged for 20 years, they could still hold fragments strong enough to reshape the story. He began by retracing Marissa's last known steps. At the HB supermarket, Ortiz tracked down Rosa, a cashier who had worked at the night of September 12 in 2002. Time had changed her face, but not her memory of that night. She told him she had watched Marissa walk out with groceries, offering a quick smile on her way through the doors. What lingered in her mind was not Marissa, but a truck. Rosa remembered a black pickup parked near the entrance, its engine running, headlights glaring directly at the doors. She had thought it strange, but never imagined it would matter. Ortiz wrote every word carefully. Then he moved to a small gas station only blocks from the supermarket. An employee named Luis still lived in San Antonio. When Ortiz spoke with him, Luis sighed heavily. He remembered that night as if it had been waiting for someone to ask again. Around 9:30, he had seen a black Ford F-150 pull up. The man who stepped out was middle-aged, short-haired, dressed in a mechanic shirt streaked with grease. Luis had given that detail in 2002. But it had been logged with little follow-up. Hearing his words now, Ortiz felt the past tighten into focus. Finally, Ortiz sat with an elderly woman named Consuela, who lived near the river road where Marissa's blazer had last been reported. Sitting on her porch, she told him that while watering plants around 10 o'clock that night, she had heard a piercing scream from the riverbank. A woman's scream, sharp and chilling, that vanished as quickly as it rose. She had brushed it aside at the time, thinking it might have been teenagers fooling around, and never told police directly. Her eyes welled as she admitted she would never forget the sound. Ortiz gathered these fragments and laid them across the map in his office. Marissa leaving the store at 9. The pickup idling at the entrance. The same truck at the gas station minutes later. A scream by the river at 10. The pieces lined up like stepping stones, and every one of them pointed in the same direction. Toward Hector Ramirez, the mechanic who had lived only blocks away. But Ortiz also knew that memories, however strong, needed the weight of proof. And in the lab, science was about to deliver something far more powerful than testimony. In the sterile quiet of the Texas State Forensic Lab, the handbag strap was placed under bright lights. Machines hummed as skin cells were processed through the National CODIS database. Detective Ortiz stood in the observation room, eyes fixed on the monitor. The screen flickered, lines of code running, numbers flashing, until at last, a single message appeared. Match found. The name burned across the display with certainty. Hector Ramirez. 100%, the weight of 2 decades pressed into that moment. Ortiz closed his eyes briefly, then exhaled sharply. The alibi that had shielded Hector in 2002 had finally collapsed under the certainty of science. No rumor, no guess, but cold and undeniable DNA. That same evening, Ortiz drafted his report. 10 pages of analysis and charts. The first line was bold and direct. Hector Ramirez's DNA is confirmed on Marissa Delgado's handbag. His alibi for September 12, 2002 is invalid. The probability of error is virtually non-existent. The report was sealed, then delivered to the department's command. For Ortiz, it was more than paperwork. It was the voice of Marissa herself, reaching across time to demand recognition. When Alina and Carlos were called, the words landed like a storm. Alina clutched her daughter's framed photo with shaking hands as she listened. Tears streamed down her face. "They found something of my girl," she whispered, her voice breaking. Carlos stood silent at first, then clenched his fists so tightly his knuckles turned white. He had suspected Hector for years, but no one had listened. Now, finally, the proof had spoken for him. The announcement reached the public in a press briefing that same week. Cameras captured Ortiz as he stood steady, his voice firm. "We now have scientific evidence in the Delgado case. This investigation has turned." The statement rippled through San Antonio. Neighbors whispered, old fears returned, and the city remembered the young woman whose face had once covered every lamppost. The silence of 20 years had been broken, but evidence alone would not be enough. To bring justice forward, Hector Ramirez himself had to be placed under the unblinking eye of the law. With the DNA match in hand, Ortiz and his task force moved carefully. They knew that one mistake could give Hector a chance to slip away. Surveillance began quietly during the summer of 2022. 2 unmarked cars rotated near Ramirez Auto Service, watching Hector's movements as he fixed brakes, changed oil, and greeted customers with the same polite nod he had offered for years. By day, he seemed nothing more than a quiet mechanic. By night, the lights in his shop stayed on late, shadows moving behind the windows long after the street had emptied. On Sundays, Hector attended church as he always had, sitting in the back row, bowing his head during sermons. The officers who observed him noted how calm he appeared, blending into the rhythm of the congregation. But beneath that calm, Ortiz sensed a man carrying something heavier than ordinary faith. At the same time, investigators returned to Hector's old statements. The friend who had once vouched for him in 2002 was contacted again. This time, with years past and the weight of evidence rising, the man admitted the truth. Hector had called him the morning after Marissa vanished, asking him to say they had been working together late at the garage. He had trusted Hector and agreed, never realizing what was truly at stake. With that confession, Hector's alibi crumbled completely. Ortiz pressed further into the community. Old neighbors remembered details that seemed harmless at the time but now took on a darker light. Marissa's friends recalled how Hector had brought her flowers, how she had declined politely, and how he had lingered outside her home more than once. Alina remembered seeing him standing across the street at dusk, hands in his pockets, eyes fixed on her daughter's window. He had always claimed he was just passing by, but the memory now carried an uneasy weight. Piece by piece, the mask of the quiet mechanic began to fall. Behind it emerged the outline of a man who had once been rejected, and who had carried that rejection like a wound. The very image of a kind neighbor was cracking, revealing something far more unsettling. And while Hector moved through the city as if nothing had changed, the walls of evidence were already closing tightly around him. When the news finally named Hector Ramirez as the prime suspect in Marissa Delgado's disappearance, the west side of San Antonio seemed to stop breathing. For 2 decades he had lived among them, fixing cars, offering neighborly smiles, attending mass each Sunday. Now television screens carried his face beside the words, "prime suspect," and the community was shaken to its core. At the corner grocery store, shoppers dropped their bags in disbelief. Some whispered that they had trusted him with their own vehicles, even their children, never imagining such a possibility. An older man shook his head, muttering that Hector once fixed his brakes for free when he had no money. A young mother trembled as she remembered asking Hector to watch her car while she ran errands. What once seemed like kindness now felt terrifying. At Guadalupe Church, where Hector had bowed his head countless times, silence filled the pews. Parishioners avoided eye contact, their prayers heavy with unease. The priest who had shaken Hector's hand every Sunday lowered his gaze, admitting quietly that evil had stood among them without being seen. An elderly woman sitting in the back row whispered that if the accusations were true, then the devil had been hiding in plain sight inside their church. Neighbors who had once praised a dead Hector's generosity now replayed memories with suspicion. His polite gestures, his quiet presence, even his stillness outside the Delgado home now carried a darker meaning. The mask of the good neighbor was collapsing, torn apart by the cold certainty of DNA. The betrayal ran deep. People asked themselves how many times they had smiled at him, spoken kindly to him, or trusted his helping hand, never knowing that he might have carried a secret as heavy as murder. The realization spread like a chill across the community. The danger had not been far away. It had been right next door. As the city absorbed this truth, one thought lingered in every conversation. If the mask had fallen, how long before the law would take him away? On the cold morning of December 2, 2022, the quiet street outside Ramirez Auto Service filled with unmarked police vehicles, Detective Ortiz stood nearby, waiting for the signal. The plan was swift and deliberate. There would be no warning, no chance for Hector to slip away. Inside the garage, Hector lay beneath a Chevy pickup, tools clanging faintly as he worked. The smell of grease and metal filled the air. An ordinary day in a place he had owned for years. At precisely 8:15 a.m., the shop door was forced open, and voices thundered into the space. San Antonio Police Department. Hector Ramirez, you are under arrest. Officers poured inside, weapons raised. Hector slid slowly from under the truck, blinking into the beams of flashlights. His hands were streaked with grease, his face calm, his eyes steady. He did not fight. He did not shout. Instead, he stood, wiped his palms on his overalls, and said quietly, "I knew this day would come." The cuffs snapped shut, and the man who had smiled politely to neighbors for 2 decades was led outside. Into the light, news cameras were already there. KENS 5 and KSAT 12 broadcast the arrest live, capturing every detail. Crowds gathered quickly, pressing against barricades. Some shouted in anger, others wept openly. A woman clutched her child and sobbed that he had once given her kid candy. An older man shook his head and whispered that the monster had been hiding in plain sight. On live television, the contrast was stark. Behind Hector stood the sign of his garage, painted with the words, "Honest work, honest price." In front of it walked Hector Ramirez in handcuffs, his face impassive, the mask of the kind neighbor shattered beyond repair. For 20 years he had walked free, a quiet figure in the neighborhood. Now the image of his arrest burned across San Antonio screens. A symbol that the truth, however late, had finally caught up with him. And as Hector was placed into the police car, One question hung in the air. Would the evidence and the courtroom be strong enough to finally deliver justice for Marissa Delgado? After Hector's arrest, the Delgado case moved into the hands of the Bexar County District Attorney. The lead prosecutor assigned was Linda Garza, a determined and sharp attorney in her 40s, known for her relentlessness in homicide trials. She laid out the case with a simple but powerful framework: motive, opportunity, scientific evidence. The motive, she argued, was clear. Hector had been rejected by Marissa, and his quiet fixation had turned into a dangerous obsession. The opportunity came on the night of September 12, when he was seen in his black Ford F-150, trailing her Blazer as she drove home, and the evidence, undeniable, was the DNA found on the strap of Marissa's handbag, a piece of property buried for 2 decades and untouched until it surfaced at the construction site. Alongside this, Garza prepared to bring in witnesses: Rosa, the cashier, who remembered the black truck idling outside the HB supermarket; Luis, the gas station attendant who had seen Hector that night in a greasy mechanic's shirt; and Consuela, the elderly neighbor who had heard a woman scream by the river around 10 o'clock. Even the ATM footage, though blurry, placed the black F-150 behind Marissa's car, supporting the timeline. To Linda, each piece linked into one chain of events. But Hector's defense was ready to attack from every angle. His attorney, Richard Cole, stepped before cameras and declared that DNA on a handbag did not prove murder. He insisted that in a neighborhood where everyone knew each other, contact with belongings was not unusual. He warned that after 20 years, memories fade, details blur, and mistakes in the original investigation could not be ignored. His plan was to focus on those gaps, to press the jury into believing that reasonable doubt remained. The stage was set for a clash between science and denial, between the persistence of a family and the shield of technicalities. The courtroom was preparing to decide whether 20 years of silence would finally end in justice. But as the trial approached, San Antonio was already bracing itself for the storm. Knowing that the verdict would either close a wound or tear it open once again, the doors of the Bexar County Courthouse swung open on the morning of the preliminary hearing, cameras flashing as reporters crowded the steps. Inside, the air was thick with tension. Alina sat in the front row, her frail hands clutching a small wooden cross, while Carlos sat beside her, his jaw clenched, eyes fixed forward. For 20 years they had lived with silence. Now the name of their daughter was about to echo in a courtroom. The judge struck the gavel and the formal charges were read. Hector Ramirez stood at the defense table, wearing a plain shirt and slacks, his face expressionless. The charge was first-degree murder in the case of Marissa Delgado. Every word pressed against Elena's chest like a stone, and she broke into soft sobs, her shoulders trembling as Carlos placed an arm around her. Prosecutor Linda Garza stepped forward, holding the indictment. She began with the story of that September night, a young woman leaving her bank shift, stopping for groceries at HB, then calling her mother to say she would be home in 10 minutes. A black Ford F-150 following her from an ATM camera. A scream near the river. A handbag buried and found 20 years later. And on it, the DNA of the man now sitting before them, each detail delivered with steady precision, each detail painting Hector into the frame. When the judge turned to Hector and asked for his plea, the silence in the room was absolute. Hector lifted the microphone and said flatly, "Not guilty." The words struck Alina like a blade, and she clutched her daughter's photo tighter, tears streaming down her face. Carlos whispered under his breath, shaking with rage. Certain that the truth was being denied again, defense attorney Richard Cole then rose to address the court. He told the jury that DNA on a bag did not prove murder, that in 20 years, memories had faded, and mistakes in the original investigation had created gaps too wide to ignore. He promised that doubt would be revealed, and that doubt was enough to free his client. The lines were drawn in that room. On one side, a story of obsession, opportunity, and undeniable science. On the other, a story of doubt and denial, pressed into the ears of the jury. And as the hearing closed, the tension only grew heavier, leaving the city waiting to see which story would be believed when the trial truly began. As the courtroom doors closed on the preliminary hearing, San Antonio opened its own trial in the streets. Coffee shops, corner stores, and church steps buzzed with one conversation. Justice had finally begun to move, but why had it taken 20 years? Neighbors who once smiled at Hector now asked each other how many warning signs had been ignored. Parents told their children that justice should never be delayed. Yet here, it had been buried for decades. Headlines filled the front pages. The San Antonio Express-News ran a stark cover. 20 years of waiting. DNA unmasks the truth. Television anchors called it both a victory for science and a failure of the system. Commentators asked the same question again and again. How could a case with witnesses, a suspicious truck, and an unsteady alibi have been allowed to turn cold so quickly? On social media, movements erupted. Hashtags blazed across feeds. Justice for Marissa. Cold case, no more. A clip of Alina sobbing as the charges were read in court spread rapidly, watched by millions. People who had never heard her daughter's name before now lit candles in her honor. Asterisk. In the neighborhoods where flyers had once been stapled to lampposts, vigils returned. Families walked together, carrying photos of loved ones lost to unsolved crimes, chanting that no victim should ever be forgotten. Candles lined the steps of Guadalupe Church once more, their flames glowing in unison. The priest's words were steady and heavy. We must turn this pain into reform. We must ensure every missing person is searched for until truth is found. Community leaders demanded accountability, pressing the city to invest more in forensic technology. To give detectives the tools they had lacked in 2002, activists called for reforms that would guarantee no case could be dismissed with a single unchecked alibi. The Delgado case had become more than one family's fight. It had become a mirror, forcing San Antonio to see the cracks in its own system. And beneath the chants, prayers, and demands for change, one truth echoed through every candlelit vigil. Justice might have been delayed, but it could no longer be denied. Yet for Elena and Carlos, the loudest question was still waiting to be answered. Would the jury see the truth with the same clarity as the community now did? The courtroom was silent as the jury filed back into their seats. Elena clutched Carlos's hand so tightly that his knuckles turned pale. After hours of deliberation, the foreperson rose and read the words that San Antonio had waited 2 decades to hear. Guilty of first-degree murder. The sound echoed like a hammer striking stone. Hector Ramirez did not flinch. His eyes stayed fixed forward, his expression unreadable. But in the gallery, the Delgado family broke down. Elena's body shook as tears streamed freely, her cries carrying the grief of 20 years. Carlos held her close, his own face wet, whispering that at last, justice had been spoken aloud. Reporters rushed to capture the moment, broadcasting live as the man once seen as a kind neighbor was led away in shackles. Outside, crowds who had gathered erupted in cheers and sobs, many holding candles and photos of Marissa. Her face lit the evening once again, but this time it was not a plea for help. It was a symbol of truth finally named. That night, in the small Delgado home, Elena lit a new candle at Marissa's shrine, but this time she did not place a single flame. She surrounded her daughter's photo with rows of white candles, their light filling the room, brighter than any year before. She whispered softly that her girl had been heard at last. The flame was no longer just a promise of hope, it was a memorial of truth. Detective Ortiz, exhausted yet resolute, spoke to the press afterward. He told them that no case is truly dead if persistence and science are allowed to work together. He admitted the failures of 2002, but reminded the city that modern forensic tools had given Marissa her voice again. His words traveled beyond San Antonio, quoted in law seminars and forensic conferences as proof that justice, though delayed, can still rise from silence. For Elena and Carlos, the verdict did not erase the years of pain, but it closed the endless questions that had haunted them. Their suffering had a name, their loss had an answer, and Marissa's story could finally rest in truth. Yet as the candles flickered in their living room, the larger lesson spread through San Antonio and beyond. That trust can hide danger, that systems must never turn cold on families seeking answers, and that, even after decades, light can still break through the darkest night. When the verdict settled and the cameras left, life for the Delgado family did not return to what it once was. Nothing could ever restore the laughter of a daughter or the comfort of her presence at the dinner table. But for the first time in 20 years, Alina found a fragile kind of peace. Each evening, she still lit candles at Marissa's shrine, her lips moving softly in prayer. The weight of despair had lifted slightly, replaced by the calm of finally knowing what had happened to her child. Carlos carried the fight forward. He began speaking at community meetings, urging investment in cold case units and forensic technology so no other family would endure decades of silence. He told neighbors and strangers alike that persistence matters, that families should never give up, even when the world grows quiet around them. His voice, once filled only with grief, became a call for change. The city too came together. Along the San Antonio riverfront, hundreds gathered for a vigil. Candles stretched in long glowing lines that reflected in the dark water. People whispered Marissa's name, their voices blending with the hum of the river. And in that light, a message hung heavy. Danger can wear the face of a trusted neighbor. Systems can fail when they grow careless. But communities, when united, can demand accountability and ensure no victim is forgotten. Marissa's story carried lessons larger than one crime. It showed the power of science to unearth truths long buried. It revealed the cost of neglect when leads are left unexplored. And it reminded every listener that trust should never silence instinct. And that vigilance is not just the work of law enforcement, but of every community member who chooses to speak out. As the candles flickered against the night sky, the city remembered a young woman who should have come home on a September evening but never did. And it remembered that even after 2 decades, truth can still cut through the dark. If you are still here, listening to Marissa's story, it means this journey deserves your like and your subscribe to Unscripted Tales. Make sure to turn on the bell icon so you never miss an episode. Please help us complete 5,000 likes on this story, because that is the target set from my mother for you. Support us. It is completely free. And tell me in the comments, from which city are you watching this cold case story?